We have an excellent final panel. We've heard from labor, we've heard from business, and now we'll get an opportunity to hear from congressional staff who are working to put in place the policies that we've heard about this morning. And so, without further ado, I want to introduce Brandon Mooney, who is professional staff on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Brandon has great experience in Congress, having worked for the former chairman, Joe Barton, and for Congressman Pete Olson, and is now at the committee working for the chairman, Fred Upton, and for the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Whitfield. And Brandon is a graduate of Austin College and Rice University and hails from a producing state. I've spent plenty of time there, and so welcome.
Thanks.
Kate MacGregor, also joining us, is senior professional staff with the House Resources Committee, and on the subcommittee for energy. She focuses on oil and gas issues, on pipeline infrastructure issues on federal lands. She has a long career in Congress, including serving as legislative director for the Majority Leader Eric Cantor during his time, and is also hailing from a producing state, is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. So welcome to both of you, and we can kick off with Kate to talk a bit about what's going on in the House Resources Committee.
Cool. I can just talk from our small bit in this whole puzzle of getting infrastructure built and updated in the United States. We approach this issue from the aspect of oil and gas production and renewables on federal lands. So every day when I go to work, I'm thinking about the 700 mineral acres of federal estate onshore and 1.7 billion acres of offshore acreage that we would like to see producing oil and gas responsibly. For example, already in the Gulf of Mexico, 17% of our nation's crude and 5% of our natural gas comes from production alone on the Gulf of Mexico. It used to be more, but thank you to North Dakota and Pennsylvania and other states like Texas, of course, always. We are seeing that percentage come a little bit lower. So when we look at issues in the Congress, we're trying to find ways to make sure production is continuing on and increasing on these federal lands, and we're seeing the benefits of America's natural gas and crude, and our new position, or maybe I should say renewed position as a global leader of energy production, and we want to sustain that. And I think part of the important part of the puzzle is making sure that in order to sustain that production, that it's getting where it needs to go. And for us, federal lands tend to be an issue. And so as we look at things in the House Natural Resources Committee, we're trying to find ways to make sure that infrastructure can be responsibly constructed and transverse federal lands in the East Coast and the West Coast. And obviously that split is a little bit different, and a lot of folks, it tends to be, when you look at Western states, for instance, federal lands make up about 50% of the acreage, whereas on the Eastern states, it tends to be more, I think it's like around 4%. Nonetheless, crossing federal lands in the East Coast is extremely important for a lot of the major pipelines that we're seeing constructed for natural gas. So that's sort of the take on the House Natural Resources Committee, and we're looking at ways to make sure that those pipelines can move forward responsibly.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. So the Energy and Commerce Committee, with jurisdiction over energy policy across public lands, private lands, generally, we stay out of their territory as much as possible, but there's a complementary effort going on. So maybe I'll tell you a little bit about where we are today, or how we got here at least. So over the last two Congresses, Chairman Upton has really undertaken an aggressive effort to educate members on the changes that we've seen in the energy landscape across the country and across the world, really the impacts that it's had across the world. So we've seen a massive increase in oil and gas production, but we've also seen it being produced in different areas of the country. So which brings to bear these infrastructure challenges, moving the energy from one place to the next. With the focus of our members is really being mainly on the consumers and on delivering energy affordably. We're really focused on maintaining production, but also finding efficiencies in the transportation network, the infrastructure there too, so we can move energy across the country. We see the challenges in the Northeast, and we've seen the challenges associated with getting projects constructed. The permitting process itself has become more challenging, more complex. So we've undertaken this effort over the last 2 Congresses, looking at the resource base, understanding the challenges to production, and then moving into the challenges of moving the energy. So we've had oversight hearings, number of oversight hearings. Last Congress, it was Chairman Upton introduced or announced his architecture of abundance effort to modernize infrastructure, to maintain a workforce, to promote efficiency, to promote energy diplomacy, and that this legislative effort really ramped up this year with the new Congress, with majorities in the House and the Senate. We've been able to really more ambitiously address this in a legislative way. So we've announced the framework, what the bill will look like, how it will be divided among, like I mentioned, infrastructure, workforce, diplomacy, and energy efficiency. So there's a series of bills that have been introduced or discussion drafts that have been announced, and it's a process. It's a deliberative process. It's going to take. It's an open process, so that means there's going to be several committee hearings, moving into markups and going to the floor. And as you all may follow, the Senate is also looking at this in a very similar way. There's also been the QER, which was released by the Department of Energy just recently, and so there's really broad recognition that energy infrastructure really being one of the most, it's bipartisan, and it's just necessary to maintain the production that we are in the United States, to maintain our place as an energy superpower now that we've become, and potentially transitioning into a net energy exporter sometime in the future. Making sure that our laws are in place and up to date. We're looking at, a lot of our laws were passed in the mid-1970s at a time of truly was a different time. Production was declining, imports were rising, and consumption was growing rapidly at that time. And then those laws reflected that time and that place. And as we look to the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, we look at our strategic reserves, we look at the restrictions on exports, we look at those things, and we're asking ourselves, does this match the current energy landscape, and are we positioning the United States to maximize the potential we have here in the U.S.? So that's sort of the direction of the committee, where we're going, and how we got here. Happy to
Great. All
talk
right.
more.
So, a question for both of you. We're 5 months into a new Congress. We have a new majority in the Senate that's really come in with high hopes, at least for returning the Senate and the Congress back to regular order. Now, whether that Republican Congress can work with a Democratic administration, I think is yet to be seen. But there are some signs, right? So this morning you're going to have a vote in the Senate on TPA and TAA, cloture on a motion to proceed that should be bipartisan, supported by both the President and the leadership in Congress. You saw long-term fix on SGR, which folks never thought would happen, the doc fix in healthcare. You saw an open process of voting on Keystone in the Senate. Plenty of amendments, opportunity for debate. But you also saw in both houses a breakdown, I'd say, in the appropriations process at DHS on the issue of immigration, backing the Congress up again into a position of a potential government shutdown. So the jury, I think, is still out, but there are signs. First of all, what are your thoughts on this? This is for both of you, and also how does this impact the energy policy that you're working on and the outlook for getting that energy policy over the finish line?
First, I'd say energy policy is not formed in a vacuum. We have really hot-button issues that the country needs to deal with: immigration, healthcare, and those sorts of things, trade policy. The Senate is also constrained by floor time, as we all know. So, there's going to be challenges, but and I think our approach with the architecture of abundance is very targeted. It's very narrow. It's focused on those things that I mentioned. There's broad recognition that there needs to be changes in modernized approach to the policy itself, and so we're taking small bites, but we're optimistic that taking this approach is going to be has the most likely chance of succeeding, but knowing that those challenges are there and that these other issues are swirling around and can influence the direction and the speed that we're able to proceed on these things.
I would say through the lens of energy policy, and I work very closely with my colleagues in the Senate side, the Senate's still trying to figure out, I think we're still seeing how effective the new majority is in how we're able to come to consensus on a lot of different issues, and the jury's still out as to, as we see more and more bills, it's still early, but as we see more and more bills and folks working together across the aisle, I think it's showing a lot of promise, especially in energy. Energy has always been a very bipartisan issue, even in the last Congress, in the House side, legislation that we've put forward from our committee, especially when it comes to upstream production and driving offshore energy production, for instance. We always garner a good bipartisan vote on those issues. And I think even speaking of infrastructure as well, and seeing that, the president has put out several different memos on one in particular that I have been looking at recently from June of 2013, talking about the importance of updating our nation's infrastructure to deal with this abundant resource. I mean, it's something that everyone's proud of in our country, and we recognize that we need to find ways to make better use of it for energy security. And I think that's a big driver that's helping to bring people together across the aisle. And I think we'll see both the Senate and the House legislation move forward in that regard.
Great. So Brandon, you spoke a little bit about the architecture of abundance that Chairman Chairman Upton over the past two Congresses has really promoted, and the 5 pillars. As you tick them off, it struck me that those 5 pillars really have a great attachment to natural gas, right? So if you think about manufacturing, right, you think about the great abundance of natural gas that we've had that's been able to drive manufacturing renaissance. Yep. Secretary Mooney has talked about this, the creation of hundreds of thousands of jobs, onshoring for manufacturing because of low-cost, affordable, reliable natural gas. So on manufacturing, on infrastructure, certainly we've heard this morning the great importance of infrastructure in being able to move that natural gas from areas from supply basins to demand centers. On energy diplomacy, a great debate in Congress on LNG exports, and on innovation too. I mean, there's no over the past decade, there really has been no greater innovative force in American business than the shale revolution. So talk a bit about how how the membership views the connection of the architecture of abundance to the natural gas shale revolution, and then how you think the public also does. So is there a connection made between the shale revolution and manufacturing and infrastructure, et cetera?
Certainly. So natural gas, the massive increase in production has enabled or contributed to a lower price, and it's also contributed to less price volatility, which is important for manufacturing. You use it as a fuel and a feedstock, and we spend a lot of time educating members on what that really means, really what it means to be a feedstock, really. How does this help, chemical manufacturing? A lot of that was educational for our members to understand that, but now we're really seeing constituents are starting to wake up and understand it in parts of the country where production wasn't an issue. In Texas, sure, everybody knows about hydraulic fracturing in the Barnett Shale, but in Pennsylvania and Ohio, folks are starting to learn about the benefits that go beyond just the production itself and the royalties and the mineral revenue that they receive. It goes beyond that. The jobs, the induced jobs are very significant, as we're seeing in the supply chain and as we're seeing in the manufacturing. So there's broad recognition that natural gas production and use is beneficial to the economy as a whole. So with the architecture of abundance, we're looking to maximize and maintain the robust industry that we have in the exploration and production, and also in the downstream uses of natural gas. So we're looking at what we're looking at, not as much on the production side, but more on the transmission, storage, and distribution side. We're looking at ways. We just had a hearing yesterday on a FERC coordination piece. We're looking at interstate natural gas pipelines, and as we know, they've become increasingly challenging to permit, not so much because of the FERC process, but because of the associated permits that you need from other agencies and from the states acting pursuant to delegated authority from the federal government. And so we're looking at ways to bring those stakeholders to the table earlier, more often, engage with the public and with the project applicant to ensure that these interstate natural gas lines are permitted in a timely fashion. Because we know that we look to New England. We had the governor of Maine testify yesterday about the challenges he has in Maine. Maine has the lowest electricity prices in New England, but they're not competitive with the rest of the country. And he's described the impact that it's had on his mills and his manufacturing base in Maine and the constituents there. Not only are they potentially losing jobs because of the fuel prices, but they're looking at their electricity prices and they're saying, well, we pay more in Maine than, again, they're lower cost in Maine than they are in the rest of New England, but compared to the rest of the country, it's very significant. And so we're looking to ways to expedite the construction of pipelines to move the energy, and we're looking for ways to maintain demand. So that we're talking about LNG exports, and we're talking about ways to use energy for diplomacy, to strengthen the United States' position in foreign affairs across the world. We're hearing from ambassadors from countries that never would have come to the Energy and Commerce Committee and said, we need help, because they're looking at the Natural Gas Act and they're saying, well, this isn't, we have a system that we favor a free trade country versus a non-free trade country. And there's a lot of question if that's the most appropriate way to address this in the 21st century, where we have a drastically changed production outlook. And so we're looking to match up those areas, and within the architecture of abundance, there's several sections to the bill that look at natural gas. I just sort of mentioned a couple, but I'm happy to go deeper if there's any questions.
I think we may have some.
Yeah, sure.
Some audience questions. So, Kate, you made a bit of news yesterday in your committee introducing a piece of legislation, Mr. MacArthur and Mr. Richmond, a bipartisan introduction of the National Energy Security Corridors Act, which will give the Secretary of the Interior the authority to designate these energy corridors on federal land and hopefully really expedite I think the intent of the bill is expediting the siting, permitting, construction of energy infrastructure on federal lands, which you all have jurisdiction over.
Yeah,
so if you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Really excited about that bill. It's HR 2295, I believe. It just dropped last night with like you said, Mr. MacArthur out of New Jersey and Congressman Richmond out of Louisiana. I think it's going to be an interesting new way to look at ways we can streamline permitting on federal lands. Because I think when you talk about, and I think what you said was really important, what about the public? And when American families look at their energy bills, I don't think they're thinking about what the portfolio is, how much of this electricity is generated from natural gas, coal, from different areas, from renewables. I don't think they're thinking about the miles and miles of paperwork that it takes to get that natural gas from an area like Marcellus or Utica shales out to New England or to other markets. But I know they sure as heck are thinking about what it's going to cost in January to heat their home for their family or other needs, just like businesses are thinking of that kind of stuff. And so we're trying to find ways to lower prices and make that paperwork a little bit simpler. So I think that bill is going to, aside from provide the National Park Service the authority to negotiate rights of way on federal land, which is so key, especially in the East Coast, and for a lot of these pipelines that are looking to site crossings of federal land, which also helps minimize the use of private land and other land. The concept behind the corridors is to, it's a common sense, hey, we have an issue. We need to cross some federal lands. Let's provide the Secretary of Interior the authority to work with other agencies and say, this is a good spot, and on this spot, we think we can streamline the right of way. And so it's not forcing their hand in any way. It's saying, let's all come together and recognize that infrastructure build out is so key to help lower prices and help utilize natural gas and domestic natural gas in our country. And hopefully it'll be, we're having a hearing on it next Wednesday, so I think it'll be interesting to see what folks have to say about it. I know that a lot of other members are dropping similar legislation too, simply to give Park Service authority. And again, I think Mr. MacArthur's bill is only for natural gas pipelines. So the fact that it's bipartisan signals good things to come, I think. So we'll see.
Okay, well, so bipartisanship has been sort of the word of the day on LNG. We had over 40 votes for the second consecutive Congress to expedite LNG permits. Over in the Senate, that was in the House, and over in the Senate, they've introduced an LNG bill, Senator Barrasso and Senator Heinrich, and that has strong bipartisan support, and now they're beginning their process. Give me a bit of your sense of the outlook for actually enacting energy legislation in this Congress. We haven't had a comprehensive energy bill in a decade, and you know we heard a lot this morning about how the changes that have occurred over that decade. If you released an architecture of abundance 10 years ago, people would say, "What are you talking about?" We have scarce energy resources, and we're importing a lot of our energy resources. Fast forward to today, totally different landscape. We need to modernize our energy legislation. So talk a bit about that and give us your sense of the outlook.
We're very optimistic. As I mentioned, we're taking a narrow approach, one that is bipartisan. We looked to the LNG debate, and we saw more than 40 members from the Democratic Party come across the aisle, vote for this bill, and they can appreciate, but we all can appreciate the benefit that energy provides to the economy as a whole. And so maximizing the potential, modernizing infrastructure, modernizing our workforce, these are all things everybody can agree on. You know, like I said, energy policy isn't made in a vacuum. We do have these other things going on, but you know, now more than any time in the last 10 years, that I think there's been more of a need and more of a chance, an opportunity to make it happen. So Senator Murkowski's first hearing, I think, is today, and they've got 2 dozen bills they're looking at. Wonderful witness. I know one from your shop here. Yeah, it's very great that they're having a hearing. I mean, when's the last time they had a hearing in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee on a bill that, you know, in the last Congress they had just difficulty getting to a hearing and to the floor was unthinkable. They had an open process on the Keystone bill. Members got the opportunity senators introduced amendments on so many different things that they were interested in, and so I think you know, they got that out of their system a little bit on Keystone, and I think most members now are really serious about moving a piece of legislation. We got to demonstrate that they can govern, and as I said, we're taking this sort of a narrow approach. It's parallel to our other efforts in the committee. We're looking at, you know, the Clean Power Plan. We're looking at the GHG regulations as a whole, but that's separate and apart from what we're doing here with the architecture bill. So we're very optimistic. We think we have a good chance. We're going to, you know, move it through the committee process this summer, move to the floor and over to the Senate, and all eyes will be on the Senate to see what they can do, but optimistic that we can get to a conference on it.
Kate, any hope for the Senate?
I mean, am I supposed to speak for the Senate coming from the House? I would say if I was shaking the magic 8 ball, I would say outlook is good.
Yeah. All right.
I mean, I think this is a new energy era. It's really exciting. You know, America is #1 again. And 5 years ago, we were talking about importing LNG, and now we're having a discussion about exporting LNG and crude. So that in itself, and seeing the benefits across our country for job creation and lower energy prices and helping our allies and using our energy as a potential economic weapon if need be. I mean, this is an exciting time in bringing more and more members to the table. And I think that in itself is showing why energy is kind of a lead issue right now in both the House and Senate, and the areas where we're looking to work together to actually pass something.
Okay, let's open it up for some questions in the audience. Wow, look at that.
Coffee break.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, Alana Shore with Politico. I wanted to ask about the specific pipeline permitting bill that's known as Hoeven-Donnelly in the Senate and I believe Upton Green in the House. This is a bill that came up last year that passed with bipartisan support, but it's one that Democrats are already signaling if it ends up in this bipartisan, bicameral effort, it might lose a lot of their votes. And this sort of speaks to, you know, is it enough to have one or two Democrats and Democratic leadership opposing, you know, provisions that might make it in here? If you could address that sort of nature of how deeply bipartisan you guys might want this.
Well, I'd look to the LNG vote. Again, I think you saw more than 40 members. So we kind of use that as a metric, and I think that's going to kind of guide us as we look to including different bills and different provisions in this architecture package. What's been announced so far has been very bipartisan. It's been workforce. It's been, you know, FERC coordination on interstate natural gas pipelines. There's been some hydropower reform. There's been some energy efficiency legislation. These sorts of things so far have been very bipartisan, and so we hope to maintain that. And you know, I think I'm optimistic that we'll continue to maintain that same level of support as we go here.
Okay, any other questions?